So this commenter makes an interesting point about the portion of my last video where I talk about my mom having trouble throwing things away. So let's talk about it. So if you missed it this morning, I made a video about being raised by my parents who were members of the silent generation, because I feel like we talk a lot about baby boomers and their impacts on culture, but we don't talk about the impacts of my parents' generation, the silent generation. My mom was born in 1944 and my dad was born in 1940. So I think this commenter makes a good point about disposable culture being bad and exploitative, both economically, environmentally, racially, all of it, of course. It's a good point. But I also think that the disposable culture was driven a lot by the baby boomers' consumerism. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about silent generation. Baby boomers typically grew up in the 50s, which was a time of great abundance, great wealth in the United States for the people who had that privilege. But even the people who were poor in the 1950s were doing a lot better than they had done in other time periods, right? So the baby boomers sort of drove this consumer culture. They drove this booming economy that was all about consumption. The silent generation, the generation that my parents were a part of, were not a part of that. That was not, I didn't grow up with that kind of consumerism in any way. So the fact that she bought this margarine and that she wouldn't throw the tubs away, I want to talk a little bit more about that. Why was she buying margarine? Why was she buying margarine in the 80s and 90s? Well, margarine kind of had a really good PR campaign, a really good advertising campaign. They were talking about how it was low fat and good for your heart and all that stuff. So a lot of people got on that bandwagon, that health bandwagon. And for a long time, I thought that must be why mom bought this margarine instead of butter. But I don't think that's why she did it. She bought margarine in tubs because it was cheaper, significantly cheaper than butter. My mom did not think that she was allowed to have nice things because the idea that she grew up with was sacrifice. Sacrifice. She believed in bettering yourself. She believed in this hyper individualism. But a huge part of her version of hyper individualism, in the way that it differs from the baby boomers, which was very much about self actualization and hyper individualism, like this idea that if you are fully self actualized, that you will somehow be prosperous, right? That was very much the baby boomer idea. That was not the silent generation. This is a big difference. You were hyper individualistic and you sacrificed so that your family would be okay. That's the kind of trauma that my mom was dealing with. So she bought margarine because it was cheaper than butter. And she did not spend on herself the way she spent on us, the way she was willing to spend on gifts, the way that she was willing to make sure that we had all the supplies we needed for all of our extracurricular activities, and the way that she was willing to sacrifice for my college education because she believed in education. That was part of the bettering yourself. But she believed that part of being a responsible adult was sacrifice, self-sacrifice. And I'm not here to say that there isn't some sacrifice that's appropriate as a parent, as a member of a community. There is. And especially we who are in economic privilege in this time period, we who have white privilege in this time period. I'm mixed race, but I have white privilege moving through the world. we who have privilege of any kind at all are being called upon in this time period to think about the ways that sacrifice is going to be appropriate for us moving forward in order to make a more equitable society. All of that's great. But what I'm talking about for my mom is sacrifice took the form of deprivation for her. She was not going to take care of herself in the way that she deserved to take care of herself because of the fear of scarcity in the future. My mom deserved butter. She deserved butter. She deserved a jacket that at the very least she took to the cleaners and had the zipper replaced. She deserved to go and take it to the cleaners and have the zipper replaced. That's the thing. Like, I appreciate the ethos of having a jacket that you love and getting it repaired. She never got it repaired. My mom knows how to sew. She could have repaired it. She didn't do that because there's this self-sacrifice, this pathology, this anxiety, this idea that if there isn't enough, then I don't get any. This self-sacrifice that she lived, that's what crushed us about seeing this jacket that she never threw out. Not that she didn't throw it out, but that she didn't think she deserved a jacket that was functional. And so this fear, this constant buzz of anxiety around scarcity, around a fear of lack of resources, it it's just this unspoken tension that lives in everything in the household when you are being raised by someone from the silent generation. It's just this undercurrent that just sits there of everything you do in life is going to require you to sacrifice and to deprive yourself in order to make it in the world. So yeah, I think this commenter makes a good point about the culture at large, about the culture that I grew up with. Um, the idea like of throwing things out among my peers, among my friends, like we, as children in the 80s, we generated a lot of trash. Like that is definitely true. And I think the fault of that lies in an emphasis on consumer culture, on corporations who weren't at all responsible for that packaging, right? They just kind of pushed it onto society. All of that is true and informs the way that I live my life now. But that wasn't silent generation. That wasn't the silent generation's fault. They were still in this mindset of deprivation and scarcity, and that deprivation and scarcity kind of meets consumerist culture, and it creates this unholy, toxic mix of a pathology where even these cheap things that, yes, you shouldn't have bought to begin with because they were cheap consumers crap, and yes, you shouldn't have bought them, but we just tend to accumulate as life goes on because that's how our society is structured. Even those things you can't let go. Even those things you can't give away, or you can't fix, or you can't repair or make them useful. They just become the soup that you swim in, and this clutter and stress in your life that has a really negative impact on your mental health. So yeah, I think it's a larger conversation around the way the silent generation dealt with all of that, but it's different. It's a little bit different than what this commenter was talking about.